Chapter 13, Section 3, Due Process and the 14th Amendment. We have learned that the 14th Amendment, along with the 5th Amendment, are known as the Due Process Amendments, especially when dealing with the rights of the people. According to the Constitution, the 14th Amendment requires that states provide due process and equal protection under the law. These requirements have made this amendment one of the most important parts of the Constitution. What is equal protection to you? Does it exist? Are you equal in school? What are some examples that you believe students are treated differently? Under the 5th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution, no government action may deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Due process requires the government to act fairly when carrying out government actions. Courts have separated due process into two parts: procedural due process and substantive due process. The difference between these two concepts is not always clear, so let's take a look. Procedural due process is based on the concept of fundamental fairness. It ensures that government application of law is fair and does not restrict a person's constitutional rights. The example in your book discusses the use of eminent domain and how the government must give you notice of taking your property through certified mail and then having a hearing. Due process applies to both civil and criminal law and usually requires the following: notice to the person of the action being taken, an opportunity to be heard regarding the action, an impartial decision maker, the right to confront and cross-examine adverse evidence, parties, and witnesses, a decision on record, and assistance of counsel. Procedural due process in the case of Snyder versus Massachusetts, 1934. Mr. Snyder and two other men were accused of murder. During Snyder's trial, the judge, the jury, a bailiff, the court reporter, and attorneys for both sides went to view the scene of the crime. Snyder requested that he be allowed to attend, but the judge denied his request. Snyder was convicted of murder. He appealed his conviction to the Supreme Court, asserting that under the Constitution he had a due process right to view the crime scene as part of his defense. The court ruled against Snyder. It said that procedural due process is violated when an action offends some principle of justice so rooted in the traditions and conscience of our people as to be ranked as fundamental. In this case, denying Snyder the right to attend the viewing did not violate his right to due process because the judge controlled the viewing and Snyder's counsel was present. In a dissenting opinion, Justice Owen Roberts wrote that due process requires that certain fundamental rules of fairness be observed, forbids the disregard of those rules, and is not satisfied, though the result is just, if the hearing was unfair. In Roberts' opinion, everyone else was at the viewing, so Snyder should have been too. Substantive due process is used to examine whether the content of a government action, a criminal or civil law, is fair and reasonable and does not unjustly restrict a person's constitutional rights. This type of due process is based on the ideal that man is born with more rights than are listed in the Constitution. Substantive due process applies to both natural persons and corporations, and they include the following four things. 1. Police power, as in regulations to promote the public health, safety, and morals. 2. Laws regulating worker safety, wages, hours, and places of work. 3. Government taxing, zoning, and eminent domain. And lastly, non-economic rights such as privacy, daily relationships, the right to die, the right to travel, and the right to personal dignity, as well as other unenumerated rights. Substantive due process in the case of Washington versus Glucksberg in 1997. The state of Washington bans physician-assisted suicides and makes it a crime. Dr. Harold Glucksberg, four other physicians, and three terminally ill patients, as well as a nonprofit organization, sued the state, arguing that the ban violated a terminally ill person's right of privacy and the right to die under the 14th Amendment Due Process Clause. The federal district court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed that ruling as well. Washington State appealed to the Supreme Court. Here, the Supreme Court focused on two due process clause issues: protecting our nation's fundamental, historically rooted rights and liberties, and defining what constitutes a due process liberty interest. The court held that the right to assisted suicide is not a fundamental liberty interest protected by the Due Process Clause, since its practice has been and continues to be offensive to our national tradition and practices. Moreover, the court held that Washington's ban was rationally related to the state's legitimate interest in protecting medical ethics, shielding disabled and terminally ill people from prejudice that might encourage them to end their lives, and preserving human life. What about your rights as students? What happens if you are suspended? Some of those questions were answered in the school suspension case of Dwight Lopez in Goss versus Lopez, who had been suspended for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, according to him. As the case goes, a group of students, including Lopez, were accused of vandalizing their school, and each student was suspended for 10 days. He denied all claims to being part of the criminal activity and filed a lawsuit that he was denied due process. Through the court system, the school pointed out that Ohio law did not require Ohio to educate its citizens and therefore owed Lopez nothing. The Supreme Court disagreed, and since Ohio built schools and established a system of K through 12, it required its residents to attend school. It became known as a property right. So now if you get suspended for 10 days, you must have a hearing with an administrator that had nothing to do with your original suspension. Usually those hearings are held on the third to fifth day of the expulsion. Lopez's case failed to allow students to confront their accusers, so for now it comes down to word v. word. I mentioned before about unenumerated rights, rights which are guaranteed based on the physical birth, including property rights, the right to travel, the right to privacy, personal autonomy, and personal dignity. We've talked about the first three, but what is personal autonomy and dignity? Personal autonomy is being able to live how you want and the way you want with little to no external influence. But what about people with terminal illness that want to take their own life? We will talk about the Terry Schiavo case, in which a woman who was brain dead but kept artificially alive, and who who has the right to pull a plug on her? Was it Terry's husband or was it her parents? And you'll see how something that seems so simple can tear an entire country apart. Dignity is the idea that as a human being, you have a special value tied to humanity, not class, not gender, not race, but in humanity. Let's look at a case of substantive due process. The case Lochner versus New York, which is also known as the Baker Shop case. The state of New York enacted a statute known as the Baker Shop Act, which forbid bakers to work more than 60 hours a week or 10 hours a day. Lochner was accused of permitting an employee to work more than 60 hours in 1 week. The first charge resulted in a fine of $25, and the second charge, which happened a few years later, resulted in a fine of $50. While Lochner did not challenge his first conviction, he appealed the second, but was denied in state court. Before the Supreme Court, he argued that the 14th Amendment should have been interpreted to contain the freedom to contract among the rights encompassed by substantive due process. The court agreed and invalidated the New York law. The majority maintained that the statute interfered with the freedom of contract and thus the 14th Amendment's right to liberty afforded to employers and employees. The court further held that New York law failed the rational basis test for determining whether government action is constitutional. The majority reasoned that the Baker Shop Act had no rational basis because long working hours did not dramatically undermine the health of employees, and baking is not particularly dangerous. What about the inhalation of flour dust? A man in Missouri working in a popcorn factory that put powdered flavoring in popcorn bags was recently awarded $20 million dollars when he developed lung disease from the dust in the air. And this isn't the only time this has happened. It also happened in Iowa and other states in which foods that cause dust become stuck in the lungs of people. So who's at fault here? Is it the company or is it the worker that refused to wear their mask? After the Baker Shop case, there was one thing that spurred the nation into a frenzy, and that was the fact that the Supreme Court put its own values on a court case toward our nation. As each case came and went, and the court applied substantive due process to property rights, the country grew angrier. In 1938, the court heard the case of United States versus Caroline Products Company. A 1923 act of Congress banned the interstate shipment of filled milk, which is skim milk mixed with fat or oil other than milk fat. And Caroline Products, a milk manufacturer, was indicted under the act. The trial court dismissed the indictment. On appeal to the federal government, the court was tasked with determining whether the act was unconstitutional under the Fifth Amendment. Caroline Products argued that the law lacked rational basis and also that the Congress did not regulate the use of oleomargarine, which substituted vegetable fats for butter fat in interstate commerce trade. Considering that Congress had held many hearings prior to passing this law, it was reasonable to conclude that Congress believed it was necessary for the public welfare. The court announced that it would apply only a rational basis test to economic regulations. The rational basis test meant for a law to be upheld, the government would have to show only that it had good reason, a rational basis for passing the law. When the court is called upon to review, the rational basis test is the least strict standard it can apply. Have a great day, Mount Pleasant.